In 1793, the newly formed United States faced a legal crisis that tested the limits of its own architecture. A single private citizen was attempting to use a federal court to force an entire state to pay off a massive Revolutionary War debt. The citizen was Alexander Chisholm, an executor from South Carolina. He filed a legal action to recover damages against the neighboring state of Georgia. Georgia responded with an absolute refusal to appear in court. They argued the federal judiciary had no jurisdiction, claiming a defense known as sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity is an ancient legal doctrine inherited from English common law. It establishes that a ruling government, historically the Crown, cannot be sued in its own courts without its explicit consent. The venue for this confrontation was the United States Supreme Court, then operating out of Old City Hall in Philadelphia, the nation's temporary capital. This dispute threatened to paralyze the republic. If Georgia was truly immune, no federal court could compel a state to obey the law. But if the federal court could force a state to pay, the Constitution would hold undeniable supreme authority over the states. The question of Chisholm's debt quickly opened up a much deeper constitutional void created by the American Revolution. By removing the British king from their system of government, the founders excised the traditional source of absolute authority. That left an unresolved variable in their political math. Who or what actually holds ultimate, unquestionable legal supremacy in America? Chisholm versus Georgia became a battle over the architectural blueprints of the nation itself. The justices had to map out the exact mechanics of a democratic state. They were forced to choose between centuries of established English tradition and the untested raw text of the newly ratified Constitution. As the first major decision in Supreme Court history, the ruling would serve as the first practical attempt to scientifically map how sovereignty operates in a republic. The court split 4-1. Justice James Iredell wrote the lone dissent, anchoring his argument in the momentum of English common law. This chart visualizes the European feudal model of sovereignty. The sovereign sits at the absolute top, and legal authority flows exclusively downward to the courts and subjects. Because of this top-down flow, a subordinate node can never force a superior node to submit. Iredell applied this logic to the case. In England, subjects demanding money from the crown could only file a petition of right. This was a plea for grace, relying on the monarch's goodwill, not a legal compulsion that could be enforced. He reasoned that because the new United States Congress had never passed a specific statute overriding this tradition, the individual states inherited this exact feudal immunity by default. Under Iredell's strict interpretation, the Revolution merely replaced one king with 13 individual mini-kingdoms, leaving state power absolute and untouchable by private citizens. The majority of the court took a different approach. Justices John Blair and William Cushing rejected tradition entirely, looking only at the raw text of the new Constitution. They focused on Article 3, Section 2, which extends judicial power to controversies between a state and citizens of another state. Blair parsed the grammar, noting it doesn't specify the plaintiff or defendant. The language works in both directions, placing them on equal footing. Justice Cushing then added a structural observation. He pointed out that the Constitution explicitly stripped states of traditional sovereign powers, such as coining money or entering into foreign treaties. Cushing concluded that states were no longer absolute sovereigns. Instead, they functioned mechanically like large corporations or bodies politic, bound by a shared charter. To Blair and Cushing, the written law operated as a blind algorithm. It applied the exact same rules to a massive state entity as it did to a single citizen, deliberately ignoring any claims of royal dignity. Justice James Wilson shifted the majority's argument away from strict textualism and into the realm of deep political philosophy and system architecture. Wilson defined the state as an inferior contrivance, a completely artificial person. He contrasted this with the Old World perspective. States were not divine or naturally supreme entities. They were simply administrative tools created to manage logistics. Wilson argued that a dishonest state, just like a dishonest merchant, makes a contract and must be held legally accountable when it breaks it. By tearing away the mystique of government authority, Wilson reduced the state from an unquestionable sovereign ruler to a suable, artificial construct that has to pay its debts. Chief Justice John Jay provided the final architectural solution to the sovereignty problem. Jay established a new premise. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, sovereignty did not transfer from the British Crown to the individual state legislatures. Instead, Jay argued that sovereignty bypassed the government entirely and devolved directly into the hands of the individual citizens. He described American citizens as joint tenants in the sovereignty, equal co-rulers, with no subjects but themselves. Thus, when a citizen sues a state, one joint sovereign is holding an artificial, subordinate agency accountable to their shared supreme contract. With a 4-to-1 majority, the court held that state suability was fully compatible with American statehood, officially dismantling the feudal model in American jurisprudence. Alexander Chisholm won the right to sue. Georgia's shield was shattered. The decision triggered an immediate political panic. Other states suddenly realized their own massive Revolutionary War debts could now be forcibly collected by federal courts. State legislatures did not view this as a philosophical victory for the people. They saw it as a direct, existential threat to their treasuries and their entrenched local power structures. The Supreme Court's pristine mathematical model of popular sovereignty collided violently with the harsh financial realities of the 1790s. Congress immediately counterattacked by swiftly drafting and passing a constitutional amendment to override the court's decision. The 11th Amendment explicitly removed federal court jurisdiction over suits brought against a state by citizens of another state. In an ironic twist, the very first major constitutional decision issued by the Supreme Court was immediately nullified by the other branches of government. Yet, while the specific procedural rule allowing citizens to sue states in federal court was overturned, the intellectual framework built by Justices Wilson and Jay survived. The legacy of Chisholm versus Georgia is that it proved the state was no longer a king. It cemented the Constitution as a contract governed entirely by the people.